Testimony in court showed she was forced to eat from a dog bowl and turn her paychecks over to her owners.
Never understand why that she didn't listen to her gut. Evil doesn't look like evil.
Two slaves and their master were in a Vista courtroom today as we learned how prosecutors plan to convince a jury they murdered a young Marine wife.
I know, this sounds like a bad horror movie, not real life. Shockingly though, this is what happened to Brittany Kilgore in 2012. She was on her way out of San Diego when someone made her an invitation to a cruise, but Brittany never made it to the cruise. A much bigger and darker plan was on. This is the full story of Brittany Kilgore, but be warned, we'll be discussing mature themes, torture, and death. On April 13th, 2012, at 4:30 p.m., 22-year-old Brittany Kilgore was getting ready to move out and head back to her parents' home. Her marriage wasn't going great. She'd felt like she'd made a huge mistake. She hadn't made a life for herself in San Diego either, so, deflated, Brittany had packed her bags. She was excited to be back with her family at least. That's when someone knocked on her door.
She was packing. She gets this unexpected visitor who shows up at her door.
It was 46-year-old Luis Perez. He was a friend of Corey's, working as a staff sergeant in the Marine Corps. He and his girlfriend, Dorothy Margalino, were somewhat familiar to Brittany, although they were not friends. Also, Luis had never visited Brittany and her husband's home. Brittany even asked him how he got their home address, to which he responded, "I asked around." Luis told Brittany that he wanted to take her to the dinner cruise on the Hornblower that night.
He was inviting her to go on a cruise, a dinner cruise called the Hornblower Cruise.
According to him, he had 2 tickets but no one to go with. But Brittany wasn't all that up for it.
And she just told him, "No, I don't want to go. I'm moving." And then Luis Perez said, "Well, I'll help you move if you go on the dinner cruise with me."
The more Brittany insisted she didn't want to go, the more persistent Luis became. He had to convince her. Brittany had a bad feeling about it.
She said no multiple times to Perez. She told him she didn't want to go. She didn't feel comfortable with him. She obviously had that gut feeling.
But Luis wouldn't take no for an answer, and he knew that if he insisted long enough, a young woman like Brittany would eventually say yes, just to avoid a potential conflict.
And he basically propositions her again, "Go on this cruise with me, and I'll get you some Marines to come and help you move your things."
So Brittany said yes, and hoped her weird date would be over fast, and Luis would help her pack and drive her to the airport. But Brittany never made it to any cruise, nor did she ever see her family again. When the authorities found her lifeless body, it was dumped beside a lake and destroyed almost beyond recognition. The 100-person investigation that followed would unveil a sinister story, one that Brittany never chose to be a part of. Brittany Kilgore was born in 1990. Not much is known about her upbringing, except that she grew up in a tiny town and had humble beginnings. When she was 19, she got married and left home.
She was very naive, came from a very small town, and so she had very few friends, and she was alone in California, very far from home.
Indeed, Brittany didn't have anyone on the West Coast except her husband and his friends. Brittany was married to U.S. Marine Corey Kilgore. The young couple had settled down in the Fallbrook Village in the San Diego area. Corey needed to be close to Camp Pendleton, a Marine Corps base. Early into their marriage, Corey was deployed to Afghanistan. And this was a very sad moment for Brittany. She hadn't made any friends of her own, and what followed were very lonely months. And absence didn't make the heart grow fonder. In fact, things only got worse after his return. The two simply didn't get along. It seemed like they were 2 young people who rushed into marriage, confusing their enthusiasm for compatibility.
And at the time, their relationship wasn't the best, and she had decided that she wanted a divorce.
And so, in April 2012, 3 years after getting married to Corey, Brittany filed for divorce and started packing her bags to go home and live with her family. Brittany was 1 step away from leaving Corey's home and heading home when she heard the doorbell ring and opened the door to Luis Perez. Luis and his 40-year-old girlfriend Dorothy had a dirty secret. Along with their friend Jessica Lopez, the couple were part of the BDSM community.
46-year-old Luis Perez likes his ex-slaves to call him Ivan. Dorothy Maraglino is the head of his household, known as Miss D, and Jessica Lopez, their slave. Testimony in court showed she was forced to eat from a dog bowl and turned her paychecks over to her owners.
Just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with BDSM, and these three people are not a representation of anyone who participates in this lifestyle. The BDSM lifestyle is based on consensual partners accepting master and slave roles. But Louis, Dorothy, and Jessica took it to a creepy level. At home, Louis was the dominating partner, while Dorothy was the submissive. However, Dorothy was Jessica's master. The three had a set of very strict rules when it came to, quote, the perfect slave. They even had a slave checklist and a slave contract at home. Inside that household, Jessica was Dorothy's property, and Dorothy had her wear a dog collar at all times. The women lived together in a house owned by Dorothy. But when Louis visited them, since he was the master, he controlled both women. But Louis wouldn't just put his partners in dog collars, he would inflict all kinds of pain on them. Louis had a history of violence in relationships. His ex-partners remember that he wanted to associate them every time they had intercourse. At one point, Louis was fantasizing about his ex-girlfriend bringing a stranger into their home and violating her together. More than once, he did not respect Dorothy and Jessica's safe words, taking things too far, even as they asked him to stop. Then things took a turn for the worse. The women started sharing Louis' darkest fantasies. That's when the three started scouting for an easy target. Brittany Kilgore was a young and vulnerable woman who had just broken up with her husband. She didn't have many friends either. In fact, she only had one friend, a woman who lived in the same apartment complex as her, Elizabeth Hernandez. But there was a twist. Elizabeth was also good friends with Dorothy. Elizabeth would often get invited to Dorothy's place, and Brittany eventually began to tag along too. But neither Elizabeth nor Brittany would participate in the BDSM activities. Dorothy had always been a bit insecure and had convinced herself that Louis was going to leave her for a younger woman at one point or another. After all, she did live together with a younger woman, and she was part of her relationship with Louis. Despite her constant anxiety and unhappiness, Dorothy never left this arrangement. She put on a brave face and advertised her lifestyle as free and open-minded. When Brittany became closer to the group, Dorothy saw her as a competition. She felt that Brittany was flirting with Louis. This wasn't true, but Dorothy's insecurities were projected onto Brittany, and it was too late to change her mind. Dorothy started calling Brittany the disease and the herpes whenever she wasn't around. Meanwhile, she was trying to recruit Elizabeth to their small BDSM community. Dorothy found Elizabeth impressionable and easy to control. Every time Dorothy would have Elizabeth over, she would discuss how much she disliked Brittany and invited Elizabeth to talk trash about her friend. But Elizabeth didn't bite. Elizabeth stopped taking Brittany to their gatherings in order to protect her. But Elizabeth made one fatal mistake. She told Dorothy that Brittany was getting a divorce and leaving California soon. Elizabeth never meant to cause any harm. She thought it would help Dorothy relax, knowing Brittany would be out of her life soon. Sadly, Dorothy took this as a now or never for her most evil plan. Elizabeth's well-intentioned confessions would not end with Brittany's departure. On another evening at Dorothy's house, Elizabeth spoke about the Hornblower dinner cruise in San Diego, something she'd recently gone on and was quite excited about. Elizabeth said she thought of taking Brittany on the cruise, just as a nice way to wrap up their time together in California before she went back home across the country. Skip to April 13th, 2012, when Louis offered an invitation to the very same cruise.
She did not want to go on what seemed like a dinner date with someone else's boyfriend. She was worried how that would look. Louis had Dorothy get in touch with Brittany and say, "It's okay with me, I was going to go, I don't feel good, you can go on this cruise."
Brittany had another friend in the house, Channy, helping her pack, and she overheard their phone conversation. Apparently it all sounded peachy. Brittany was laughing, giggling, and sharing jokes with Dorothy. She was very friendly to Brittany now. Also, she was pregnant. Dorothy told Brittany that was why she couldn't go on the cruise, and for once, she wasn't lying. Except Brittany would never make it to the cruise. When they hung up the phone, Brittany turned to Channy and said she might as well go to the dinner cruise. She wasn't into Louis, but this seemed like a fun experience that she couldn't have back home, where it was colder and there were no coastlines. So at 6:10 p.m., Brittany texted texted Louis and accepted the invitation to dinner. He texted back and assured her that he would have 5 guys come to her house in the morning to help her move. At 7:30, Louis Perez showed up at Brittany's place again to pick her up. The cruise had left at 7. Before leaving her house, Dorothy and Louis' phone numbers with Channy. She still didn't feel 100% safe, and she wanted her friend to be on guard.
Never understand why that she didn't listen to her gut. Evil doesn't look like evil.
At 7:40 p.m., Brittany entered Louise's van and they drove off together. At 7:50, 10 minutes later, Brittany texted Channy one word: help. Channy saw the text at 8 p.m. and she began calling Brittany, but the calls wouldn't go through. 5 minutes later, Channy gets a text from Brittany's phone saying, "Yes, I love this party." This was bogus, and Channy knew it. She kept calling Brittany's phone, but there was no answer. She then texted the phone saying, "I'm calling because I need to hear your voice." Louis' idea? He texted her back as Brittany saying, "Okay, music is too loud." Meanwhile, Channy spoke to Elizabeth and told her about the help message. Elizabeth immediately called Dorothy, demanding an explanation. But Brittany was still in the car with Louis, and Dorothy denied having spoken to Brittany. In fact, she said she had no idea what she was talking about or what Brittany was doing. Elizabeth then called Louis. He said he was at this club, partying with Brittany, when she started talking to another guy and left him there. Elizabeth worked for a phone company, and she reminded Louis that phones are traceable, so if he was lying, the police would eventually find out. Louis panicked. Everyone was in fact at Dorothy's house. Louis, Brittany, Jessica, and of course, Dorothy herself. Worrying about traceable phones, Louis grabbed Brittany's phone, drove all the way to downtown San Diego, threw Brittany's phone in the water, and then drove back to Dorothy's place. Of course, this would all be traced through his phone.
Luis Perez had 2 lives going on. He had dual lives.
Luis Perez did have a dark past. This was no 50 Shades of Grey at all.
The next day, Brittany was missing. Channy and Elizabeth were both worried, and Elizabeth called Dorothy with a more cautious attitude. She wanted an explanation. Dorothy babbled and then handed the phone to Louis, who told 3 different versions of what had happened that night in under 10 minutes. Elizabeth knew this was the time to call 911. When the officers invited Louis for an interrogation, he was fidgety but went through with it. However, he didn't like it when they wanted to search his car. Mud was all over his tires, and inside they found an unlawful weapon. He was immediately arrested for possession of that weapon and interrogated about Brittany's whereabouts. When the officers got to Dorothy's house, nobody was there. The detectives also noticed Dorothy and Jessica must have left for a long time, as several things were missing from the house. Also, the place had recently been cleaned thoroughly. There's an important detail here. Brittany was still the wife of a U.S. Marine. This generated a lot of attention to the case. NCIS got involved immediately.
Actually, NCIS was on this case from day one. This investigation to find Brittany was a 4-day sleepless race against the clock.
Almost 100 people were involved in the investigation. On April 17th, the detectives finally located Dorothy's car at a hotel parking lot next to the San Diego airport. They knocked on the door, and Jessica opened the door ajar, greeting them from a dark room. She was talking very slowly and quietly, and suddenly the officers noticed blood on the floor. They kicked the door in and found that Jessica had attempted to unalive herself. Well, it was a fairly minor cut on her throat. She hadn't gone through with it. But most bizarrely, she'd left a note for the authorities saying, "Pigs, read this." In the note, Jessica took full responsibility for abusing Brittany. She had slammed her body into the stairs, restrained her wrists, ankles, and mouth, tasered her, and tied her neck with a rope. She then tried to dismember her, but failed, doused her in bleach, and dumped her body into Lake Skinner. At the end of the note, Jessica said she loved Dorothy and loved being her slave. It sounded a lot like Jessica was forced to take full responsibility, as she was Dorothy and Louise's slave. Dorothy had just flown out of California to visit her relatives. It's likely she was the one who committed the final act. Jessica was taken to the hospital, and detectives rushed to Lake Skinner. Brittany's mutilated body was found next to the lake in dirt. The autopsy confirmed everything Jessica had written in her note.
22-year-old Kilgore was strangled, and that her killer or killers tried to dismember hamper her using some sort of an electric tool.
Meanwhile, officers conducted another search of Louise's car. This time, they found bloody plastic gloves inside, and the blood matched Brittany's. With Jessica's note in mind, the police searched Dorothy's house again and found several objects containing Brittany's DNA. They also found a sex dungeon that Dorothy was currently converting to a nursery, as she was 8 months pregnant. Yep, a BDSM nursery. Dorothy was arrested in early May on suspicion of murder. However, her DNA was not on any of the evidence. Apart from the receipt for multiple cleaning products and circumstantial evidence, the prosecution had nothing on Dorothy. But going back to Louise's place in Pendleton Base Camp, the officers found notes written by Dorothy sharing Louise's fantasies of abducting and unaliving someone. Finally, all three were in custody. On October 21st, 2015, Louise and Dorothy were convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and attempted SA by restraint. Jessica was acquitted of the conspiracy charge. They all received life sentences.
This was a once-in-a-lifetime case. Some of the darkness and some of the twisted motivations behind this case was overwhelming.
The saddest part was that as the trial was unveiling all of the gruesome details of Louise's BDSM world, the media made Brittany a part of it. Many articles made her look as if she partook in their activities, and she simply fell victim because of her own sexual deviancy. This was not true. She was an innocent woman who had done nothing with this group of people. She was lied to and lured into a horrific scene that will haunt her family and loved ones forever. Brittany went in a heartbreaking, outrageous way, and it's hard to imagine her loved ones will ever recover from this memory. Hey, thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on this tragic case? Let me know in the comment section. But before you go, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more. Till next time, and stay safe.